So let's talk about stories. I like stories a lot. Stories are good. I'll give a brief introduction to myself. If you don't know who I am, probably not most of you. I'm Siqi. I run a company called Runway. We're a next generation finance company. We're funded by Andreessen. And then my background is in engineering and math. This is my fourth time being CEO, third time being a founder. The last company I was CEO was a company called Sandbox VR. So I've been talking a lot about storytelling, fundraising. There's content on LinkedIn and on Twitter, but that's my background. I'm happy to just get into fundraising content if that's interesting. I do have experience raising for somewhat of a hardware company. Sandbox VR, if you don't know what that is, we have these stores around the world and you go and buy tickets to these experiences. You're on a motion capture stage. We built our own hardware and content. So let me paint a picture of that company. So this is 2018 and this company was founded in Hong Kong. And if you know anything about raising money, generally a few categories of things are harder rates for. One of them is a VR in 2018 because VR was dead. And VCs generally don't like to invest in retail businesses like restaurants or something or stores. They also don't like to invest in games because until fairly recently, until Andreessen started a games fund, hardware is notoriously capital intensive. And on top of that, VCs generally don't like to invest in international companies. So Sandbox was an international company building hardware, building games, and also was a retail company in VR. So it was a difficult raise. So the long about way of answering question is that no matter what you're building, what you're selling is emotion and a story. And so I would think about it not differently at all. And so this is a great cue for how I think about fundraising in general and what a good story is. So if you work backwards from where you're trying to get when you're raising money, you're trying to get to a yes. And so it's worth breaking down how do people make decisions in general and get to a yes. And it is the rational and I think incorrect view to think that investors actually make decisions somehow logically or rationally. We like to think so, they like to think so, but no human actually does that. All humans make decisions based on feelings, and we feel a thing, we do it, and we kind of rationalize it later. And so if you work backwards from that, what is the emotion that you want people to feel to get to a yes? And so when I craft the pitch, I explicitly make it a story, not a 10-slide pitch deck that you can find on the internet, because that is possibly the worst template you can use. Usually it's like problem, opportunity, competition, market, team, whatever. The reason why that sucks is if you trace the genetic tree of that deck, it always goes back to one of two firms, Sequoia and Founders Fund. And I have no doubt that is actually their preferred template. But if you think about your assignment, it's very different from what they're trying to do. That's their preferred template because they are trying to filter out the bad companies as fast as possible and invest in the good ones as quickly as you can. You want people to invest in your little company no matter what. The incentives are completely not aligned. So the time-tested way of delivering emotion is stories. That's the vehicle that we humans have invented to do so. And so when I craft this pitch, I start with that story. When I start writing that story, I start with what is the sequence of emotions that I want people to feel. So my current set of emotions when I do a pitch starts with amusement, leading to surprise, leading to curiosity, leading to awe, and then leads to the final emotion, which is greed. And greed is what gets people to say yes. And so breaking down those emotions, I want people to feel amusement because I want them to know in the first minute or so, even if they don't pay attention, or even if they decide to not invest, at least they won't be bored. So it's worth their time. That amusement then leads to curiosity, which is they might learn something interesting about the world that they didn't know before. And the great thing about being an investor is that that's what you get to do all day. You're hearing stories about people's life experiences, and they found some secret in the world that's so interesting that they're willing to devote the next couple of years of their lives to. So that leads to curiosity. And you pay off the curiosity with this is a surprise, which is that is as interesting as I was hoping for. And given that interest, if X, Y, and Z happen step by step, then, oh my God, this could be one of the largest companies in the world. That leads to awe, which then leads to greed. And the final question that you want to hear, and the only good question you want to hear is, how can I invest? All other questions are bad. So I would not think about it any differently at all. You're telling a story, you're trying to get somebody to say yes. And that involves getting people to feel things. But I think the way I think about it is like everyone is actually in the same business. They're in the business of getting returns. And so it's not that you don't invest in hardware or not. I have not convinced you that you should make an exception to invest in my hardware company, is the way I think about it. I think it's quite difficult to identify that. There are some signs though. I think the base answer is don't talk to just them. Don't even talk to their portfolio companies. Talk to the portfolio companies that did not work out. Everyone's friends and everyone is best buddies until things go wrong. And when things go wrong, you don't want your investor to be the people making your life difficult. And that comes out. So that's like the real answer. I mean, the other sign is, what are you talking about when you're talking to an investor? And some people like to talk about exits or marketing. I like to talk about what are we building for the customer and what problem are we trying to solve? Some investors who can get deep with you, who care about that deeply rather than just return. And I think those are some of my favorite investors. And they may not be yours, right? I think actually culture fit, just like you hiring any other employee, is super important. And you are hiring a very long tenured employee that you cannot fire. That's the way I would think about it. And you want to do all the things that you would do if you're making that kind of hire. I mean, probably there's number one and number two. I'm going through one right now. But number one, that happened earlier was, when COVID hit, right? I was just appointed CEO of Sandbox VR about 6 months before COVID hit. We have 400 employees. We're doing like close to $20 million in revenue. It's profitable. And we're about to raise a V. And then COVID hit, and Sandbox VR is a completely retail business, right? And so if the world shuts down, we make no money. So having to like go from a hot Series B to we're going to have to lay off 95% of the company, including myself, really sucked. So that's the first one. The second one is right now, like I'm running a company with my daughter having a brain tumor that was diagnosed about a month ago. So getting a PhD in brain tumors while running a company is also like pretty hard. But I don't know. The way I think about these terrible experiences, and also when I've had like worked at difficult companies or for difficult bosses, the thing that got me through is like the Calvin and Hobbes comic. You know, I don't know if you read Calvin and Hobbes, but Calvin has his dad, and anytime something difficult happens, he's like, this builds character. And it's like not very sympathetic. But I think about that. I'm like, this builds character. Any set of experiences are particularly difficult are a set of experiences that no one gets to have. And you get to grow from that and become a different and stronger person. And so I kind of like value it. Yeah. Yeah. I think, this is actually a variation on a similar question, right? Which is like, the firm doesn't invest in hardware and I don't check that box. How do you do it? The reason why people buy B2B SaaS products, by the way, is to get promoted. So what I'm hearing is like, you don't have a table stakes list of things. You should probably have it. But if you don't, it also means that you probably haven't convinced them that if you buy this, you're going to definitely immediately be on the track to get promoted. And so it's a two-sided equation here. And so if your product is valuable enough and it doesn't check out two boxes, it just means that they don't want to exclude those two boxes because the motivation isn't high enough. So I think you can look at it on both ends there. Question to ask is, what are you trying to make people feel with that number? If you understand that the reason why people do anything is because they feel something, then when you're presenting a piece of information, you're not just presenting a piece of information. You're trying to get them to feel something. And so you have a particularly impressive piece of metric. You should include it, right? But you should also think about like, you have to embody their sort of mental model and think about what are the things that are going to make them suspicious. That the one thing I would say about like metrics in general is you should not overplay or oversell the state of your metrics, whether you have good numbers or not. Because the default is most founders will say, no matter what numbers I have, they're amazing. And let me tell you why that is the worst thing to do. Because one of the frameworks I have too about fundraising is if you look at it as a sort of a rational decision in theory, you can break it down into two components. One is, what is the likelihood of success of this company? And the other is, if successful, what is the size of the outcome, right? And you would think a rational investor multiplies it two, gets some hurdle rate that says if this valuation is lower than this expected outcome, it's a good investment. I'm going to get positive return. In practice, that's not how it works. The term that dominates is actually the second one, which is, what is the size of outcome if successful? And so your job is to convince a investor that you're going to build one of the largest companies on the planet. You should never lie in your pitch deck either, obviously. So those are the two things I would say. One is, what do you want them to feel? If they don't feel anything, then I would just put in an appendix. And two is, that you never want to overplay your hand. If you don't have good metrics, you say they're great, you're not super ambitious. And if you have great metrics, you think are great, you're also not super ambitious. So there's like no possible like way to win. So the story I'll tell is, in my second company, before we were raising our seed, we put together a deck, and we iterate on a deck. We got a bunch of feedback on the deck, and I memorized the deck. And then when VCs would reach out for a meeting, because of my second company, they asked if we had a deck. I said, we don't have a deck. The thing I was trying to do is, we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to tell you about what we're doing, and we're going to see if we're fit for each other. And so the answer to your question is, you're right. It is not just the deck. It's probably not even mostly the deck. It is this weird animal magnetism that people, like, whether they admit it or not, feel. And the question is, like, how do you create that feeling? And why do people feel that? So I think this comes down to mindset and frame. The default mindset and frame for a founder pitching an investor is as follows. The person across the table from me is Mr. Moneybags, and they have to give me money, right? That is not a winning frame any more than like where you're trying to sell to a customer, please buy my thing. No. Like, I built a thing. It's going to solve your problem, and it's going to make your life better and get you promoted and save you a bunch of money, right? And so I think the correct mindset, the mindset I tried to have, and I think it is actually a more empirically correct mindset, is that the person across the table from me in a pitch meeting actually has a much harder job than me in this meeting. I consider their job to sell me a liquid US dollar. What they're getting for it is a one-way ticket to 100x return count. I'm trying to figure out why is their dollar and multiply. And I'm not saying that, but when you're thinking it, people can feel it. And I think that's a really underrated thing that people don't talk about, because people think it's just facts. But at a seed stage, especially, it really isn't. People are trying to size you up and evaluate you as a founder. And if you cannot sell an investor, you are probably less likely to sell to a bunch of customers who are even more demanding, possibly. I can recommend 3 books. The first one is The Book by Alan Watts. It's more of a religious book, but I like it a lot. I think what that has in common with the second book I recommend, which is more popular, Sapiens by Yuval Harari, I think, whatever his name is. It puts the human experience and our culture within a biological, historical lens. I find that also be useful. And the third book is like Way Practical, which is Demand Side Selling by Bob Moesta. That one reminds me how important it is to think about it from the customer's end and deeply understanding the customer. And like, I feel like I really didn't know how to do that until fairly recently. One of the things that I believe to be true is that the most obvious advice should be the ones that you pay the most attention to. Because if it was obvious and it was easy to do, then it would no longer need to be advice. And so the advice I hear a lot is talk to customers. Talking to customers and understanding their needs deeply and what their motivations are and where they're coming from, what gets them promoted, is actually really, really, really difficult. But getting that right is what informs your ability to sell. And in the case of a fundraise, your customer is an investor. So really understanding what makes them tick